From Ops to Dev, Understanding the Evolving Developer Landscape with Andrew Fawcett. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. Hey, Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on. When we started having this discussion and discussed the journey that you're going to talk about, I was immediately intrigued because that resonates so much with a lot of the members of our audience. Today, we're going to be talking about the journey. So me as a previous old ops guy, getting when I was first dipping my feet into the dev world, this would have been so valuable to me. So now that you're doing it now, I'm like, I would have loved to have seen this back in the day, because there is a lot. There's a lot of ingrained knowledge, like regardless of whether or not you're coming from the dev world or from the ops world, there's a lot of things that you just pick up through experience and through proxy and things of that nature that you can't find in a book, you can't find in a classroom, you can't find in a boot camp. And when you walked me through this, I was like, that makes so much more sense now.
And I think the reality is like, however one would have approached it before the advent of AI and assistants and agents and whatnot is the same but different. And that's what we're going to touch on a bit here as well, is to how you can keep watch of things that you would normally have done in this transition, but help use AIs in that transition and mode, but doing it in a safe and kind of aware mode of thinking, which I think's very topical for this age we're living in, where agents are augmenting the things that we do. And there's a tendency to lean back a bit. And I think it's a chance to make sure we still sit up when we're using them.
So we definitely have a lot to get into, and I'm going to save the preponderance of my questions to the end, because I want to make sure that we get into it. The first thing that we have at the beginning of the show is we talk about what AI tool we're playing with currently. I don't want to give it away, but if you have another one that you also want to talk about outside of what you're going to talk about in your talk, is there anything else that you're like have been having fun with recently?
I think the most fun, honestly, is with Cursor, which we will be talking about in this session. And prior to that, I was using ChatGPT, but really the advent of MCPs has really meant that I can be more efficient. But prior to that, I was using ChatGPT, copying stuff in and out of it. You know, in some sense, I kind of enjoyed that because I felt more in control. I copied and pasted, I updated, I saw what was happening. There's a certain anxiety raised, which I'm grappling with and getting on top of, thankfully, with Cursor, that is very rapid. And there's a sort of rush mentality to it. And I'm a developer and engineer, and I want to know what's going on. So I've kind of ebbed and flows from fun to frustrated to calm. And now I feel like I'm taming the beast, that I'm enjoying it a lot. So there's definitely a lot of learning to go on to how you sort of work with these in a sort of harmonious way. And, I'm grateful that the folks at Heroku that I'm working with are very much invested in using these tools. So I learn a lot from them as well. And we'll see some of what that learning's taken shape of in this session as well. So I think Cursor's been one of the big ones for me of late.
So I don't want to just plus one, but I will admit that I have also, since our discussion, I installed and started playing with Cursor myself. I had been putting it off for a little bit. I've heard that. Did you do a comparison between Cursor and Windsurf before you got into it, or
very, very briefly? I did it the other way around. I'd been using Cursor a lot, and then I suddenly tried Windsurf. I think it was last week. And it honestly, a lot of these depend not so much on the tools, Cursor or Windsurf, but on the models you're using. A lot of them use the same models and things like that. So I don't want this to sound too much like Windsurf's not as good as Cursor, but I didn't have a great experience out the bat with the same job that I was asking it to do. At the time, I was porting some of our Java samples to Node, and I needed some help with that. And I gave both of them that request. And Cursor just seemed to be better off the bat at asking the right questions and coming up with the right task plan than Windsurf did. But honestly, that was a very, no pun intended, cursory look at Windsurf.
there. I have heard that it's each one is better depending upon like your level of experience and what you're trying to get out of it. But we can.
It could be that windsurf, because I've seen a lot of the marketing and framing is good at initially creating things like websites and stuff from scratch. Whereas my goal, it's pretty tedium of kind of some of the DevRel things, but I was taking an existing app and I wanted it to digest that and create it in another language, retaining the features. And yeah, in that sense, at least at the high level, it wasn't for me. But I think I should go back and look at all of them, as I think that there's a lot of change happening with all these tools. So
I do. I'm not a big fan of the term vibe coding, but what I'm getting from people responding to Windsurf is that Windsurf is better for the vibe coder, whereas Cursor is better for the actual, like, a person that's got a bit of experience.
Right. Yeah. I think I've been thinking about that a lot recently from our conversation a few days ago, because I think these tools do depend on your expectations and the scope of the ask. Like, undoubtedly, I think most of them will create something net new, and largely it will run without any compile errors, and it will just show you something. And if it's a small scoped ask, a very simple app, or something you need it to do, it's again small in scope, it's a good thing. But as we start to look at the broader scope of manipulating existing apps and making changes and then iterating on an app, I think that's where you need to have some development or engineering expertise to know how to break that down and think logically about the tasks and how it would be, executed with this tool, this agent at your side. So I think, when you're doing vibe coding, if you're starting from scratch and you want an idea, you've got a prototype out there, then it'll do a decent job at just creating a thing for you with very little interaction. And if that's what your scope is and your expectations, then I think that if that's what vibe coding is, then that's great. But actually,
whatever you do, don't put it in production.
Yeah, I'm more in the realm. I want to see the code. I want to use it to augment my productivity, not replace it.
Totally. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right. So without further ado, then why don't we get into it? Because I know that there is going to be a lot of questions after this, and I want to be respectful of your time.
No worries. Okay. Yeah. So it is a time of change, and this talk and this thought process is really about, we've spent a lot of our time as engineers coding on our own. And in some cases we pair programming, we had another human being by the sides of us. But ultimately what's happening now is we've got these chat agents, and that's creating more of an iterative process in our development cycle, or inner loop, if you will, as we start to code. And what that's meaning, though, as we've just discussed in this just a few moments ago, is that the circle of developers is growing, and it depends on the scope of what you're trying to achieve. So I think it was a really good conversation we just had, because for this session and this discussion, we're really talking about what's in the green area, and we're talking about people with skills that do have an awareness of what an app is, what services are, constraints about how you need to deploy them, storage, database, and things. And when you look at the folks in the middle, for sure, the coders and the architects have that. They know actually how to code without these technologies. But then as you get into database admins, DevOps folks who are learning, and even some engineering managers, less so. But they still have that kind of baseline bedrock of an understanding of what an app is and taking it to production. And I think that's where we can ground this conversation, because there's a lot of debate about whether a salesperson or a consumer or a marketing person, biz ops person with no development skills whatsoever can make that shift to a developer. And I think as the technology gets better and the expectations about what those types of users want and what they're expecting to do with the output change, then it's getting real. But I think it's a very different conversation to be had when we talk about zero technically aware people sitting down and creating apps with these technologies. So I wanted to draw that green circle around that. And as I talk to you, Chris, a lot of your audience that are listening here, DevOps and database admins and so on, that are wanting to move into sort of broaden themselves out to that circle. So I think this is a really good time to take that knowledge and not actually forget that knowledge, but actually leverage that to make sure you can use these AI technologies as an asset to you to help your learning experience and become that developer, because you've got that grounding. So it is a circle of developers that's growing, but what are some of the things that we need to keep in focus as that sort of evolution of how we build apps is happening around us? Well, as we just discussed, the access to AI tools means that there's more developers, not fewer. We're redefining what a developer is with these tools. The other thing that's really worth in keeping in mind, I'm a bit of an API junkie myself, so APIs rule the world. Everybody knows that. Probably most people on the call are aware of that. But really, the AI agents that are automating a lot of things for us, whether it's our development processes, helping us deploy applications or build applications and whatnot, or whether it's APIs that are doing things with actual services out there on the internet, they all thrive on these things because APIs that are well described are machine discoverable as well. So, as a developer or wanting to move into development, there's probably a lot of thoughts around, should I go into web development or should I go into building mobile development? But I would argue that it's an interesting place to start is API development, because there's so much to be achieved and fueled from being an API developer in the first instance. And then the other thing to keep in mind when we're in this sort of evolving world of what a developer is that don't forget that the user experience becomes more important, not less. And I say that because there is a tendency to use the UI, the agents, to generate UIs. And again, it's great as a starting point, but really don't forget some of the lessons around what we're all experiencing as consumers, is that we need to identify the personas and what the user journeys are, and all of those things that need to be done still need to be understood. And AIs can help with that process. So let's dig into each of these three columns. And when we come back to AI, AI tools are extending more developers. What's the things that really would happen? Let's just back up a little bit and think about if you had a development team that was 50 strong, suddenly growing to 100, or let's go even more granular from 10 to 50. You'd suddenly think about more governance. What are your coding guidelines? What is your kind of workflow for getting code through development into testing, staging, and then in production? You'd want some alignment with the architecture so that these new developers wouldn't suddenly start adding new services or new libraries that weren't part of what your approved stack is, or don't fit with some of your constraints as a business. And likewise, your coding guidelines. Well understood test data. AI is brilliant at creating test data, but is it going to create test data that's relevant to your business and your application, and performance testing also? So while we're kind of suddenly feeling all of the influx of the performance, the productivity and performance of these AI tools, these are things that you still need in place. And if you haven't got them, then you absolutely need them. And AIs will absolutely slurp all of this information up and use it readily. But if you ain't got it, they're not going to do a good job at making it up unless you provide some guidance. Likewise with AI agents and API first development, if you're going to get into API first development to help fuel this growth of agents consuming APIs, then understand separation of concerns. And this is a term that you can Google about and understand readily. And it's really all about how you separate your logic from your front end logic to your back end logic. And API development is key, as is the design and the documentation discoverability of your APIs. And agent-ready APIs are basically what you should be striving for. And it turns out that it isn't really much to think about for agent-ready APIs other than good design, good documentation, discoverability. And if you were building APIs in the first instance, then that's what you would be thinking about. And finally,
when you say quick question. When you say discoverability of your API, what does that mean?
What it means is there a central place for the APIs that you're building that maybe AIs or humans can discover, like a catalog of the APIs that you have, a website where you can go and say, I need an API for a certain thing, and it'll find that API and give you the open API schema, and you can bring that into whatever system or tool that you're using. So it's really just a search engine for APIs, and there's many tools out there that do that and services that do that. But make sure that you're kind of not just saying, oh, there's an API over here and such and such will give you the open API schema, because that doesn't scale. You need a central place for them. So that's what discoverability means.
Thank you.
From a user experience point of view, just know what the users want. Make sure that you have good design input when you're using the AI tools. Figma is readily available as a tool and a construct that AIs will understand. So if you're already using Figma or other tools to create and define what user experience looks like, please use that. I mean, ultimately, again, AIs will create a UI for you, and you can start with that and use it and iterate with the AI. But if you've got a very earnestly discovered UI input from your designers through user research, then give it that. Make sure you select your UI frameworks as well. The AIs will generate apps that will use particular frameworks that they've got in their models and understand are popular, but you may have particular frameworks that work well with your target devices or customers, or just work with existing code base. So you can be selective about the UI frameworks you're using, and think about design components as well. One of the things that is important is that as you create the kind of gloss or topology of how you describe your application, it can be easier to talk to the AI about, oh, we need this particular card component that represents the user's details, or a card component that represents how we're editing a job or a particular account information. So design components is a mechanism that designers use to bridge the gap between a design that on paper or in the abstract versus what exists at code level. And the moment you connect those terms, then when you're interacting with the AIs and the designers, the two represent each other directly. And so that you can say, we're going to reuse this component and it's called X, and the AI will know what that is and know where that code is. So design components are kind of both bridge the design world and the implementation world. So these are just, the point of this whole slide is really just to say there's some principles here that you've probably heard of if you're in a DevOps world, or you're in DBA world, or even development world, that even though these tools are evolving around us, that are still very, very important. And that's there's loads more that I'm sure folks would be commenting on, maybe even challenging some of these. But the whole point is, like, leverage what you've started to hear or what you know, and really bring that into this. Don't kind of sit back and expect it to come to you because the models are clever. They know of these things, but how to bring them to the forefront is only going to be driven by you.
There's certainly a lot of bleed over from the basic technical architecture standpoint, like all of the old paradigms about what to take into consideration when you're designing hardware, networks, Active Directory topologies. All of those things are covered in here as well. So this should be very similar to not one for one, but very similar to what people are building and designing and architecting today.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So what's important to agents when you're interacting with them? One of the things that I learned is I first didn't give them enough information. And when I step back, I think this is kind of what I kind of worked out of my head when I started working with more junior developers over the years, is that they thrive better from being told the why, the what, than just the how. Because then they can be more imaginative and actually contribute to building the app. And it turns out agents are like that as well. So when I started to go and have an agent like Cursor go and edit my application, I said, oh, go add this field here. Here's the class. I'll go do that. And I was being too granular. I was giving it the how. And I was kind of then not very impressed with the results. So think about starting a conversation. We'll see some techniques in a moment of how you can create a memory for the agent that describes why you're doing a thing and what you're trying to achieve as much as the how. The other thing that makes we're going to dig into this more, your experience more harmonious, is sharing your working practices, because it will start doing things like running the build, checking the logs for you. It will start doing Git flow with you if you want it to. But everybody has their own working practices of when they feel they want to do a commit for a part of the feature that you're developing and stage that. And you can dictate that properly to the agent, and it'll work with your existing processes. And documentation is another really important part, because you have a lot of knowledge in your head, whether it's the requirements or whether it's a library that you're using is a really important thing. So all of this planning it can't be underestimated. In fact, I've started a brand new project today, and I spent a good 2 hours doing a lot of planning with the AI. And this project I'm working on is a lot more accelerated now, less frustrating. And I'm just going through working on the features iteratively with it. And I'm not having to remind it, you remember we said this, or have you forgotten about that? Because I put the time in to give it all this basis, which is really worth it. So make sure you understand the why. The inner loop will happen more smoothly if you share your working practices, figure out what tools you want it to use. I even told the AI today, because Cursor particularly will run builds for you, and it'll tell you what any errors or warnings in the build log, and it'll try and fix them. And it'll just sit there fixing them, which is awesome to sit and watch all the warnings and the linter warnings. But it won't run your app and tell you whether there was any errors at startup that were introduced with the changes. And the reason why is because the app, if it's a web app, never returns. So it never sees the console output. So one of the things I've been doing is teaching it a technique where it'll write a small shell script, and you'll see this in actually, no, you won't. I can share it later, where it'll write a small shell script that will run the app but kill the process 10, 15 seconds later and output the log. And that way the agent can do it for you, then look at the startup and then say, oh, I introduced a startup error, and fix it. So the inner loop gets faster than you having to, I'll start my web server, copy paste the log output and tell the agent. So really optimizing together your inner loop works very well. If you can stop and say, why haven't you got access to that data? Why can't you see my logs? It's tempting to kind of just push through and copy paste, and it'll ask you to do that. If you don't tell it, it'll say, I can't do that. Can you copy paste the logs for me? And so I'm kind of saying, don't accept that. There are ways you can make it easier for it to see some of the output from the inner loop, and obviously then it'll be reactive accordingly. As I've said, documentation, the why, the what, and the how can be given to it. The code base map is an interesting one. If you've got a new code base, we'll see this as well. You can actually get it to create documentation on a code base and use that in its thinking and processing. And one of the things that is kind of obvious now I think about it, that Cursor doesn't do is, and largely, and none of them will, because it bloats the kind of requests going to the LLM, is it won't take the entire code base in every single request and reason about that. It'll only take bits of the code that you're working on or are in scope in the conversation. And what that means is it'll come up with suggestions that might not be good for the other parts of the code base or the config. But if you prime it with a document that describes the app, what are the important files, what are the configuration, where are those files, and make sure that's part of the conversation always, then that code base map helps it give you more accurate output. And there are ways in which you can configure Cursor to create and parse the application, but it's quite shallow. So you'll see in the demo I can give how I've asked it to document the app I was working on, which is quite eye-opening actually in its own right. Even if you're a new developer to some code, just seeing the documentation written by an AI is quite amazing. SBOMs are important if people aren't aware. They're software bill of materials, which, when AIs are creating code for you, knowing what libraries it used is really important. And there are techniques where if you're using containers and use something called cloud native build packs, they'll output SBOMs. And that's a good governance tool to see exactly what's in the app and what isn't.
Can you train it to not use requests with 2 S's and a K? so that they...
You could definitely put that in its memory, and it would do that for sure. So yeah, AIs can generate documentation and they can consume it. So let's kind of dig into how we can be a bit more harmonious. And this is kind of a weird experience for me. I was just chatting with you before the session, Chris. Like most DevRel folks are used to doing demos that we practice and it works. It doesn't. So if I look a bit squirmy, it's because I've been using Cursor for a while now, and I think I've managed to get it to do what I want, but it might. So rules. The rules are the way in which you can calm the experience. If you're getting stressed or frustrated with it, then step back. What rules have you given it? Are those rules active at various moments in time? And there's also some rules that are freely available on the internet. Playbooks.com have a task list rule and a memory rule. And these are simple textual descriptions you give to the AI to tell it to do things that we as humans do all the time, break things into smaller chunks. It's less stressful.
Interesting.
We get kind of ways of seeing results more incrementally. And then memory is just a rule that says, watch out for things that happen in the conversation and then write that down. And those persist, as the name suggests. So those are available. I'll show, I've configured them already in my Cursor config, but I can show where they are. Coding guidelines I don't have active in this demo, but it's pretty obvious what you would do for those. Bring your own coding guidelines in or others. And the dev workflow we'll go over as well, because I really like it to use local get and between tasks commit that. And obviously I'll squash those eventually. But in between tasks, I like it to build, because it'll generate a load of code and sometimes say, I'm off for the next task, Andy. I'm like, whoa. Does it build? Does it start up without errors? So I'll teach it in my workflow to do that before it commits. And then this idea of additional docs, they do pretty well at parsing existing information. So I'm going to actually just drop out here because I do have my little cheat sheet inside here, and I'm just going to be quiet. I'm going to be brave. And so one of the things I did off camera, so to speak, but this is exactly the same thing, is give it this initial request. By the way, I promised to show you those rules. So if I go to Cursor, Settings, and then Rules, there's user rules which span any project. In here, I've got a few sort of MPC ones, and .NET and Node.js code guidelines here. If I keep scrolling down, here's the memory rule, which is the one that I linked to in the deck. And if I keep scrolling past that, then there is the task rule, which is that one there, just past there. Example scenario. So all these rules are just plain text that describe, they're in markdown format. So those are active always in its context that you're chatting with. So what I did is I told it to store in your learn memory instructions for how we work together. Here are my requirements. When making changes, I always want to use a task list to review the task list before starting. So that's another thing that reduces stress, because ultimately if you go in YOLO mode, it'll just run to the hills with your stuff and you'll be watching it scroll by going, goodness gracious, what's going on? Right. So always pause between tasks. Show me what you're going to do. After you've completed a task, I want you to build the application and check for errors and warnings. And then it's important after a task it's done, we mark it's complete. And you ask me for approval before moving on to the next. And then this last bit here is what I was talking about earlier. When you get my approval to finalize each task, update the documentation for the app, which I'll show you in a moment, then update the task list. And then finally, always commit the changes to Git before moving on to the next. So what happened is it generated this rule. It literally wrote its own rule. You told it to. And because of that, a rule I added earlier, learnedmemories.mdc gets created under here. And you can see how it digitized what I just typed in there. And there's various sections, user preferences. And you'd think that you could type into this, and you could, right? But I've found describing in plain English what I want, and it then updates these sections much easier. So it created this collaborative workflow. And it broke it all down, and that's what it will read always now. So watch out for this if you're using Cursor. Sometimes it flips to manual, and you think, hold on, the memory's not working. That's because it doesn't always include it. You always have to set this, and occasionally it gets unset if you find things going astray. So this means that every chat I'll integrate with always parses these rules. So that's what happened when I used that expression. And save that. I don't know why there was a change. And then what happened next is I asked it to build some documentation. And this one did take some time and depends on your code base. And this could be expensive. So watch out for it. And I'll show you what it created in a moment. But I said, create an app.md file in the docs folder with detailed analysis of all the files in project. Be sure to include all the information you shared in the app.md. It does have a tendency to tell you things in the chat window. It doesn't write to the doc. So I always like to put that in. And then I use git ls files, which lists, if it's a project like this that has like binary files and stuff in it, you don't want it trying to attempt to analyze those. So that lists all the files that are in source control. And then I wanted it to read all the code and HTML files and describe the app architecture, configuration, and also database schema. And I'm happy to share this repo after the call, but let's just look at it. That's It's this one. I put it in preview mode. The first time I got it to do this, I was amazed. Like, there's things I didn't know about the code base, and I'd written it that it pulled out. So it knows it's a .NET app. It uses Razor. It's configured using Redis. There's a database URL. These are environment variables. It knows where the database is defined. It pulled out some information about the project. Here's the program.cs. I love .NET. It's so like retro. Like, everything starts with program.cs. I just love that. It tickles me. What else? It knows that this is a model file. So it pulled out the database, a file. This is a note-taking application. If it wasn't obvious, I hadn't said that already now, but it's a note-taking app. And so on and so forth. And it went through and detailed some of the methods. And so this is good for me as a human, but it's also good for the AI. Because remember, in our learned memories, what did we tell it to do? We actually said consult app.md if it exists to ensure that you've got more accuracy. Now, it doesn't always do that, but it most of the time it does. So anyway, I won't scroll through all of this, but I think the database schema is a bit further down here as well. Yeah, there's the database schema. So we've done that. We've got our learned memories. We've got our app. And then what we're going to do now is see how this works. So I'm going to ask it to add a feature. Let me show you what this app actually is briefly as well. I've got a little screenshot of it. Because building the app and modifying it probably isn't the most important thing I want to show you, rather than the principles. So yeah, it's a sticky app using SignalR, so you can like open multiple windows and have multiple users all kind of not vibing together, but collaborating together to create notes and stuff. So we're going to have it create a feature that changes the color of the notes. So we're not going to go through all of the steps it creates, but we're going to go through enough of them to get a gist of it. So I'm just going to go and grab my request to it. This is partly because I just don't want to watch you guys watch me fumble typing, actually. So here's the request. Create a task.
Don't mind at all.
Here's the request. Create a task list to add the ability for the user to change the note color from red, yellow, and green by clicking on the note header. Review app.md as part of your analysis. I want to review the task list. Some of that's redundant based on the user memories I've given it. I'm just going to, there we go, check always is switched on. But I sometimes like to just say it just in case. So let's see what it does. This is the moment where we're like, has all of this prep been worth it? Is it going to generate something intelligent? There's an interesting thing. Well, let me wait, see if it notices it before I tell you what might happen about this app.
While we're waiting for that, there's no, never mind. Here it goes.
Yeah, so finally I need to review. What are invalid arguments to read? So sometimes it fails to read things. All right, now it's reading. So good. It's reading the documentation it wrote itself about the app, which is cool. That's really important because it should learn something quite significant about what this app currently does. Yeah, update the context and show the color. Okay, update Note Hub. Yeah, these look good. That's the main client-side code. So now it's created the task list. Let's scroll down. See, I've created the task list. It's put it under docs. Please review the task list. Let me know if it's okay. So one thing that I want to take a note of here, if I hadn't have done that app.md, it would absolutely have just assumed color needed adding to the database. And I'd have a load of tasks on here updating the database. There's a little bit of that, but not so much. And that just means that it would have eventually figured out color is already on the database. I've just not exposed the color field in the UI. But that takes time in the iteration. It's frustrating and creates more tendency to deviate. So it already knows a lot about this app by just reading the documentation. So yeah, was there a question or a thought or something like that?
No, this is interesting. Game Over Dave has a couple of different questions. I want to make sure that I get to his, but also give you time to get through this as well.
Okay, yeah, let's see how far we get, and we can get to questions quickly. So sure. Please review the task list. Let me know if you'd like any changes. So I'm going to say this looks good. Let's see what happens. It should opt to start with the first task, and I want to see whether it's going to use the memory. So task 1, backend review, read the model. So the note file shows that, look, the note file shows that it's already in place. Color yellow and green. Make the changes, default yellow, default color, verification of the backend part. No other changes are needed. Existing string type. So it's figured out there's already, so now there we go. It's doing it, you see. So it's made a change somewhere and it's building it and it still builds. Brilliant. I mean, call me paranoid. Maybe folks will watch this. Do you really have to do it every task? It's just really comforting to know incrementally everything still builds. So now, do you have your approval to finalize a task? The task will involve updating the documentation. So now the documentation that we created is already incrementally being kept up to date, and it'll update the task list and commit it. So let's just say yes to that. And I think you probably get the idea even at this stage. It'd be fun to continue to see what it did eventually, but we'll just watch it do this first task, and then I think we've all got the idea of what's actually happening.
Have you ever, while you've been playing with this, felt the need to build in additional emergency brakes? Does it ever go so fast that you get a bit nervous, or?
Yeah, and the way to do that is you can hit the stop button or type. I mean, if it makes you feel better, you can type stop in big caps. And it
does that work? Does that work?
Yeah, it does. I mean, but sometimes, and you can see it changing files now. It's already changed the files, which comes back to the task list. If it's gone really crazy, you can go to your GitHub and then roll them back. I don't know if it's already done the commit now or hasn't made the changes. I'll start by reading that. So it's actually, it's already done it like while we were talking. So it's already on to task 2. But crucially, I said yes. And then when it did the build commit, it committed it. In fact, you can see the history now building up. There it is, feature 1, completed task. But now I can see, so if it made a dog's dinner of editing these files in this particular file, I can always use good old, roll back and tell it to have another go at it. And it actually does a good job at figuring that out. One thing I've noticed is don't do things without telling it what you did. It's not great if you go editing the files or you do things like change the branch or roll back. If you do that, tell it you did that, and then it knows.
Oh, it doesn't rescan and
no, I've not found it. I mean, even building this demo, I probably spent too much time practicing this the other day than I should have done, given the spirit of this whole session. But I confused myself on it terribly by saying, "Oh, that's good, it worked." That's made me reset my demo, and then the next time around it was different, and I eventually cottoned on. It's because I was confusing it. I need to come out of cursor, back in again, reset things properly, and then I got a more consistent thing. So it looks like it's done even more this time. It's gone and updated the code, so we can just say, I've no idea whether this works, but we know it runs and built. We know it builds, so I'll just say yes. And then so on and so forth. Now we're in a kind of rinse and repeat where we're seeing the task list changing. Has it changed the task list? Sometimes it forgets to do that. No, it has. There it is, completed task. And we're on to the next one. So that's kind of that bit of the demo. The only other thing I wanted to show was the always flag. If you use this memory feature, just watch out. It's a major gotcha. This kind of self-documenting thing can be expensive. The reason I didn't do it today is it took about 5 minutes and it was a relatively slow smoke code base. But if you're doing service orientated and things are smaller, then the scope of the service might be well enough. And if you tell it to keep the docs up to date, then you're investing in that initial investment, keeping up to date. So code remains the center of everything. The whole point here is don't forget your learned experience around testing, security, deployment, collaboration. There is a lot of help in these 2 steps of ideating and coding. But when it comes to deploying things to the cloud, especially the DevOps folks on the call here, there's a lot, and it can slow you down even with the AI. And AIs will help us with that. But this is a bit where I think we really need to pay attention. If we're not even paying attention up until steps 1 and 2, like we've just done here, how you actually get it deployed and measured and monitored and upgrading things in production is really important. And once you get through all of that, you get to enjoy the launch. But then, of course, features come along and users want more. So the thing that I want to pass on here is when you're looking for support, and it might be interesting going from a DevOps role where you kind of know all of this, you might think, well, I know all of that, I'll then do all the coding, but you're really kind of splitting your focus at that point. One of the things that's close to my heart, even working in Salesforce and now latterly in Heroku, is that I want to spend time doing this bit. I want to focus on my application. And PaaS platforms that help elevate some of the scaling, the integrations, the DevOps infrastructure are really helping you have that focus. They're not replacing the fact that you need to be aware of all of the things on the left, but they're helping manage all of that. So I think the message there is just, keep an eye on tool chains and platforms that are helping you do that. And obviously, full disclosure, I work for Heroku, so we'd love it if you considered that as a platform that helps you do these other things. But broadly speaking, that's another message I want to get across here, is like AI will only get you so far with the code and things. But, if you don't want to then use up all of the benefit of all of that productivity gain, managing getting it into the cloud, then do look for a PaaS platform that helps you do that. And that's the last slide, really, with just some learning points of best practices, packaging, governance, AI enablement, and some things if you're interested in exploring what Heroku does in this regard. That's my last slide. I'll take some questions.
It's interesting how we have been trained to interface with computers in such a certain way that the old paradigm of garbage in, garbage out kind of we've wired our brains to talk to computers differently than how we talk to humans.
Yeah.
And now we have to reverse that and talk to these agents in the same way that we talk to humans. And it's kind of the folks that are getting into it now, they're having a much easier time of it than we old hands are having with it. I want to say it feels that way anyway.
It does. No, I love that analogy. I mean, showing my age even more, it's a bit like when the internet search engines came out, it's all second nature to us now that if you're searching for something, be a bit more explicit because you'll get better results out of it. And the same applies with this evolution now, is just quality in, quality out.
It's okay. So to get to a couple of the questions, let me scroll back up a little bit to stay relevant. Daryl has been spending a lot of time in the AI space. Good for you, Daryl. It's very important to stay relevant. Okay, so Game Over Dave did ask a question about MCP servers. Any experience or opinion with that?
Yeah, I have a strong opinion for those. I think they're great because they're making this more about what the agents can do actionably for you. We've gone from a world where and this is me, like probably even 2 months ago, I was using ChatGPT, just the window, and I was asking it and giving it fragments of code, and it gave me fragments of code back, and I copy paste it. And I thought that was productive. But now when I'm using Cursor, and you saw it in action, it's using tools in the MCP world that will read the files, update the files, and run a terminal to run the build. Those are all things without that I would have to go and do. And occasionally it will flip to telling you that, but don't believe it when it says it can't. Just insist, saying, no, you can run that here, run that from your terminal. And eventually it'll remember how to do it. I don't know why it does that, but it does that. But that's the MCP technology in action. And you saw on the last slide there, Heroku has an MCP server for its CLI. Salesforce is releasing one as well, which means that it will, you can stay in the flow of focus more easily. And as a developer, many people on the call realize that context switching is kind of our downfall. We hate doing that because it just ruins our flow. So I can stay and deploy this thing to a test environment. I can manage a database all within that experience, because in Cursor and many other tools that are emerging now, I can attach my MCP servers that know physically how to go and do that thing without me having to do it manually. So I'm a big fan of how this has changed the shape of how I'm using agents and the productivity of it. Be careful with it, though, because certainly if you're using it to do deployments and manage services, your access rights for those services should stop this, as in you shouldn't have access to production and databases and things. But if you happen to do, because you're a one-person shop, then you really need to pay attention and maybe not go in YOLO mode when it's doing these things, especially if it's stuff externally. So just be aware of it, switch to the different modes accordingly is what I would say, depending on the scope of what you're asking it to do.
Awesome. Thanks. Going back to your SBOM comment, Dave also wanted to mention that sometimes he's noticing that the models are using some of the older libraries. Have you run into that, and do you have a cure for that yet?
Yeah, I have. I put it in its memory. I just say, hey, that's the old version of this thing. Go search on the internet. Cursor's today, actually, and yesterday, it was actually better. I'm building a Spring app for Spring AO. I'm attending next week, and it picked for the first time ever, it picked the latest version of Spring Boot, the very latest one, and it did that by searching the internet. So sometimes it does it unprompted, but you could put it in the memory. You could say, whenever using new libraries, please go to the internet and check the latest to mitigate that. So just type that in the chat and tell it to put it in its memory, and then it'll go and update that MDC file. And because that's always present, then it will always do that. But look out for that, because you're right that there is a tendency with the age of the model. Same with the APIs and the code it generates. It can be a couple of years out in some cases. So you'll generate code that works and functions, but it might be not be the best practice. So sometimes you'll have to prompt it to go say, is this really the right modern way of doing it? So yeah, largely the memory and the prompts you can give it in that will help mitigate that, but sometimes you just have to ask it to go check the latest.
Gotcha. And is leveraging memory also we were talking about name squatting. Is leveraging memory also the way to mitigate that as well?
I'm not familiar with that. What did you say? Name squatting?
Oh, when somebody creates a repo that sounds similar to a popular one, and then people accidentally mistype it, leverage it, and then all of a sudden, boom, they've got malware.
Oh, right.
In their supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, if you can think of how proactively it can mitigate that, describe that to it and tell it to commit that to memory. If there's a way that you would mitigate that, describe what you would do and tell it to commit that to memory, and it will do its best to try and automate that. Yeah.
Nice. All right. I think this is a rabbit hole that we could spend days going down, but I do want to be aware of everybody's time and that we're stopping everybody's lunch. So why don't we put a pin in it? And we do have the winner of today's $50 worth of cloud compute credits for AWS, and you will be surprised to hear that the winner is Game Over Dave. So Game Over Dave, congratulations. You've won the $50 of AWS compute credits for the day. Well, you've won before, so ping me on the back channels, and I will get you your new Bedrock money to burn, because I know that's what you're going to use it for.
Congratulations.
Awesome. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on, taking time in your evening, my lunch period, but your evening to chat with us and share your knowledge on this. All of the links mentioned in Andrew's chat, I will be placing in the show notes. And you indicated that you had a repo for people to go and play with this as well. Yes, I'll send you that momentarily. Cool. So I will put that in the show notes as well. And folks, have fun playing around with all of the AI stuff. Please, as Andrew said, be expeditious and monitor your spend as you're going through this. It can be very easy to burn through a lot of money very quickly. Ask me how I know. Awesome. Well, everybody have a wonderful evening, morning, day, and we will see you all again next week for some more vBrownBag fun. Thanks and have a great night. Bye-bye.